It's time to get your music radio ready with the Audio Skills Podcast. It doesn't matter what type of music you're creating or what gear you use. It's all about the technique. Get ready to turn your home studio into a place where your music goes platinum. Now give it up for your host, Scott Hawksworth.
Hey everyone, Scott back with you for another edition of the Audio Skills Podcast. We've got a bit of a unique show for you today where we're going to be talking about recording and mixing, not necessarily for music, but instead for film and television. I'm of the mindset that learning about other audio disciplines can only help you expand your own knowledge as you work on creating fantastic sound in your home studio. And to help me cover all of this will be Matt North, who is a pro audio engineer specializing in audio post-production based out of Norwich, England. Now, before we jump into all of that, I wanted to offer up my audio tip of the week. And each week I try to give podcast listeners a piece of the kind of tips and techniques that I cover more in depth in tutorials on audioskills.com and our YouTube channel, or just offer up solid advice to help you with your music making. And that's what this week's tip is all about specifically. You know, sometimes it can be really difficult to find time to record and mix music. I know I've struggled with that myself. Life gets in the way, you're struggling with a project and demotivated and so on. Other times it's difficult to just finish a project, especially in a home studio. You know, you can spend forever just tweaking a project, especially when you're not specifically spending money for that studio time. In my experience, the best way to combat all of this is to simply set recording and mixing schedules for yourself. I am a huge fan of this. If you use Google Calendar or some other planning software or even an old-fashioned date book, use it to plan out your studio time. Treat yourself like a professional even if you don't feel like one or don't have to be a professional, quote unquote. You know, if you're just using a microphone and a laptop, go ahead and still treat that like it is a professional studio and you are paying for that studio time and schedule it out. You know, I'm an entrepreneur, so I don't exactly have a boss. I get to set my own hours. But being goal, task, and more importantly, schedule driven has helped me so much in so many things. You know, each week you should have at least one recording, songwriting, mixing, or mastering session. Make time for it and stick to it. That's how you develop habits and grow your efficiency, because I want you to make better music, but that can't happen if you're spending hours and hours fiddling with one thing. That can't happen if you never seem to be able to find the time to record or produce. You won't get better if you're not actually doing. So, bottom line, I know that was long-winded, but schedule home studio time specifically and stick to it, and you will not regret it. That's my audio tip of the week. All right, now to shift gears to our main interview and topic of discussion today. I am so pleased to be joined by Matt North, who is a pro audio engineer educated at the University of Lincoln, and he's worked on film and TV programs for production companies like Spindle Productions, the BBC, and many more. And he's going to be sharing his knowledge and expertise with us and actually educating me a bit on this side of the audio world. So, hey, Matt, how you doing today? Welcome.
Hey, I'm good. Thanks. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
I'm doing good. How are things across the pond this spring? I know you mentioned that you had to take a week off because it sounds like things have been pretty busy for you.
Yeah, no, they have. It's been good. It's been a good start to the year. Obviously, things politically are a little bit crazy over here at the moment, as they are everywhere. But let's not get into that. Let's focus on on the good stuff. So, but sure. Yeah, all good things.
Right on. So kind of to start us off, can you just tell us a little bit about your experience and career in audio production and kind of how you got your start in sort of the film and TV world of audio?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess the place to start is I mean, I've always loved kind of music growing up. I was in bands as a teenager, and as I find when I listen to podcasts and listen to other professionals and how they got into the industry, 99% seem to stem from a love of music, performing music. So yeah, my background really is in music. As I say, I love it. So when it came to me finishing high school, I was wondering what I could do. I didn't go to university straight out of school. I decided to have a couple of years out working whilst I decided what I wanted to do. And then I one day had enough of my job. I thought, just sort of sod it. I'm just gonna kind of, look into studying audio, specifically music. I was just, I hadn't even thought about film sound at that point. So I applied and got accepted onto the audio production program at the University of Lincoln back in 2009. I think that was now. Crikey, that's quite a while ago. So yeah, I kind of started on that. It wasn't until the second year that we kind of did a module on, or it could have been the end of the first year actually, a module on audio for visual media. And it was kind of like a light bulb moment went off when it's sort of like, this is incredible. Like I'd never thought about this before. It's kind of like, this is where I want to focus kind of my energy and my studies. So for the rest of my degree, I kind of focused in the area of sound for visual media, both location production and post-production, sound design and everything like that.
Right on.
So yeah, that's kind of where everything started out. And then when it came to graduating, I wasn't too sure what I wanted to do. I obviously wanted to get into sound for visual media, whether that be location or post-production. I wasn't too sure at that point. But a friend that I studied with, fortunately, had been working as work experience throughout his third year at a shopping television channel. So it's the rival over here in the UK to QVC.
Okay, yeah.
So he was working there as sort of a tech ops, so doing bit of sound, bit of cameras and stuff like that. And just as I graduated, they were hiring. So he put in a good word. I went along for an interview and managed to get a job as a technical operator. So that involves shooting a bit of cameras in the studio, a bit of lighting, which I'd obviously never done before, and also mixing sound for live broadcast, which is normally fairly standard setup. A couple of studio mics, couple of mics in the studio on presenters and guests. And after a few months, an opening came up in the audio department and I went for it and I got the promotion, or kind of sideways promotion, I guess, into being a solely audio operator. So I was fortunate enough over that period, so early on in my career, to over this period of about 8 months, mix over sort of 500 hours of live broadcast audio, which is a great way to cut my teeth, so to speak. It was
absolutely
thrown into the deep end. And whilst I say a lot of it was fairly basic setup when I look back on it now, but it was a great way just to kind of throw me in at the deep end and to kind of explore that side of things, working in a production team and everything like that. But I was always actively seeking out more opportunities, and I was educating myself even further in my spare time. And a position came up down in London as a sound recordist for a small kit and crew company. So the company hired out cameras and professional production gear to a wide range of clients, and they had an opportunity for someone to join their team as their sort of staff sound recordist. So they would go out with their kit and their crew for a whole range of productions, their main client being a primetime BBC show called The One Show, amongst many others, as well as sort of some corporate shoots for some of the clients and things like that. And I was fortunate enough to get that position, so I moved down to London and spent about a year working down in London, doing various production shoots, so sound recording using boom microphones, radio mics, mixers into cameras, and more of a run and gun style thing than a cart-based setup, which I can talk a bit more about in a bit. And then after about a year of that, for personal reasons, I decided to move up to Norwich, which is sort of east of England, about 2 hours from London. There's not really much of an audio scene up here, so to speak, or much of a media or TV, but I do some work at the university here in Norwich as a media producer for them. So I create a lot of visual media content for them, both audio-wise and visual-wise. And then in my other side of stuff that I do is my freelance work. So I kind of take on all sorts of post-production, mainly projects now, and whether that be sound design for short films, mixing for short films, also for a lot of kind of branded content, so for viral marketing and stuff like that. So I'm kind of well covered in that, if that makes sense, in that kind of area. It's like I'm spreading my wings quite wide. But
right on.
But yeah, so that's basically me. So
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. So bottom line, you've got a lot of experience and you've sort of worn a lot of hats during your time working in audio. So to kind of shift gears a little bit here, you work in Pro Tools. And, this is something that, the digital audio workstation is the heart of, if you're making music or any kind of audio, your digital audio workstation is where a lot of the magic happens. And, someone such as yourself who has obviously worked in this for quite a while now, do you have any tips or advice for folks who might want to work more efficiently in either Pro Tools specifically, or if they're more general tips in any DAW?
I mean, I think the first thing to address really is there's a lot of talk, I think, in pro audio about what is the best DAW, digital audio workstation DAW, whatever you want to call it. What is the best, what has the complete skills, feature set that's going to enable me to do my work quicker, more professionally, to a high standard, etc. From my experience personally, I don't know if there is such a thing as the best. I think there's obviously Pro Tools has kind of risen throughout the industry's progress
as the standard,
as kind of the standard, I guess. But there's so many kind of competitors coming out now, with sort of Nuendo. I think I saw something today, they've just announced Nuendo 8, and they're kind of aiming that at post-production professionals, as well as sort of Studio One. There's obviously Logic for music production as well. So I think there's quite a wide range of options for people who, both from the music side of things and in post-production as well. But the reason I use Pro Tools is, that's what I was kind of taught as part of my degree. So that is kind of what I have kind of come to know. And anybody who works frequently in digital audio workstations will know how important shortcuts are and muscle memory and everything like that. So that's kind of what I've gotten used to. But in terms of tips for working with inside Pro Tools compared to anything else, I make a big use out of window configurations in Pro Tools. So as part of my workflow, I have a specific template that I load up for every single project that I do, consisting of various dialogue tracks, effects tracks, sound effects tracks, music, atmospheres, all of that kind of stuff. And so I kind of work with Windows configurations and programming those to shortcuts to enable me to very quickly change my track views. So my template has probably got something like almost 100 tracks in it, for example.
Wow.
So I can quickly just with a press of a few buttons on the keyboard, I can limit that down to say my 10 dialogue tracks that I may be working on. So as I'm playing through and I'm editing something and there's something in the dialogue that kind of sticks out, I can quickly, instead of hiding tracks and kind of, trying to zoom in on that particular section, I can very quickly change my view just to the dialogue tracks, and I've kind of got it set up how I want it, how I like it. So any files that I receive from the picture editor of the audio session, I can import that into my Pro Tools template and very quickly kind of map that to my track lay and how I like to work, and then use those kind of Windows configurations, shortcuts, memory locations, things like that to enable me to glide through the project as quickly and as smoothly as possible, because that's a big thing as well. Often we're working to tight deadlines, so being as speedy as you can without, if you can save 10 seconds by going through a few menus, and you can spend those extra 10 seconds, sweeping through an EQ trying to find out that problem frequency, that's time well saved. So I guess that's kind of the only tips that I could kind of really think of, other than, thinking about what you are doing.
Sure.
Being very methodical about it as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a great point. That was actually one of my audio tips in a previous episode was, learn to use and make use of mixing templates, because it can save you so much time, and also just help your general workflow. If you know what tracks you have, where you are, where to find what you need. And of course, every project is slightly different, but kind of having a framework that is already built that you can kind of, put your project into. That's got to be helpful for sure.
Definitely.
So my next question here is, this was really interesting to me. So you offer audio restoration services, which is including, removing or lowering unwanted noise, distortion, hums, pops, buzzes, things like that. Now, sometimes folks recording music and, I always recommend, even if they're doing their best, to try to get it right at the source, which again, I do recommend. That'll make it a lot easier for yourself.
Definitely.
But they might run into these issues. They might have some project that is like, man, we really like this, but it's got these issues. What kind of strategies, if you could just kind of give an overview, really, do you employ to fix these types of audio issues?
Okay, well, I mean, when I studied audio, there wasn't really at that time anything out there on the market in terms of digital tools to be able to help with this kind of situations. Mm-hmm. There was very expensive hardware tools from back in, sort of denoising units and everything like that.
Sure.
But with the advancement of technology, I kind of quite heavily rely now, actually, and as I think a lot of other post producers do around the world in terms of, who work in audio post, on a product made by a company called Isotope called RX. So it's actually the release date today of the new version of RX. And I've literally, just before I come on this podcast, just downloaded it. So I'm intrigued to try it out.
Right on.
So basically it's an incredible tool that is, I like to describe it when I talk to students when I kind of are with them at the university as well, is talk about, it's kind of like a Photoshop for audio. So it will display your audio file as a spectrogram. So that will allow you to see, instead of a waveform, or you overlay a waveform on top of your spectrogram. And in the same way a waveform works from left to right and over time, you have a spectrogram that highlights particular frequencies, volume, or their level in terms of a brightness of color. So for things like sirens in the back of a piece to camera on location or something like that, sometimes you can visually see
when the siren comes in
of that siren, and you can visually see it in the spectrogram. So that, and there's some amazing tools that you can use within RX that will help you to push those noises either down completely into the noise floor, so they are virtually unheard without damaging the original audio. There's some crazy algorithms that are going on there, and it is just a lot of the time it is kind of thinking that this tool can no way get rid of that for me, and then a bit of tweaking, a bit of critical listening and being like, is that working? And you can do pretty powerful things with it. So sometimes a case of using the declip module enables you to take a waveform that's probably been squared off or clipped at a certain point. And I'm guessing the way it works is it takes samples and kind of interpolates in between those samples of what data has been chopped off and kind of and thrown away. So it's an incredible tool. I quite heavily rely on that. Obviously, I don't know how much you've kind of gone into sort of 32-bit float and everything like that with your listeners, but I mean, it's not something I really use much in post-production anyway. But that would enable you as well to kind of recover any clipped audio after the fact if you've recorded at that bit depth. So RX has been a great tool over the recent years, and it's really kind of cemented its place in the industry, I think, as an amazing and a vital tool for anybody who's kind of doing that level of audio editing. And there are certain features that lend themselves to music producers as well. There is a kind of a deplosive module that they've recently brought in, which a couple of clicks of a button can remove plosives from voices, saving you having to go in and kind of get rid of all of anything below 120 hertz just to save a plosive at a certain point during a take, for example. Maybe that can help remove that instead. So it's an incredible tool. So if anyone hasn't heard of that, then go check it out. I would fully recommend it.
So you kind of mentioned this actually just now in your last answer. You mentioned about you listening critically to, if you were trying to edit out a siren or using this tool and is this working, is this helping, whatever. Do you have any tips or advice for folks who are wanting to improve their critical ear?
I think I really struggled with this. I'll put my hands up and kind of put myself out there. I struggled to kind of develop my critical ear, and I mean, before I studied at university, I kind of kept all my digital music collection at 128 kilobits per second and kind of just, shoved it on and wasn't really listening to it in that much level. And now I, would kind of be horrified at the thought of doing that. But I used, there is a couple of great tools out there. There's certain apps and tools that enable you to kind of learn your frequency range quite well. So, for example, I think there's a sort of like a gamification kind of style of this called quiz tones that I've used quite heavily in the past.
Yes, quiz tones. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of the thing I loved about that was how it can take music that you know very well, that you've already got on your phone or anything like that, and can boost it at 3 dB at 240 hertz and 3 dB at 300 hertz, and you've got to guess which one it is, based on your knowledge of frequencies, and it will play just one version. And it's a great way for you to critically start thinking about, I mean, the way I kind of picked up on it is kind of learning those sonic signatures of those frequencies, and how at certain levels, how they can kind of change your perception of the audio, change your perception of certain instruments in that music. That's how I really kind of develop my critical ear, as well as just sort of taking a step back. And it's, especially in film, it ruins every film for you from that point that you kind of realize and kind of get into it, because you're no longer immersed in the film, you are breaking it apart. And as is the case for probably a lot of music producers as well, once you enter this world and you develop a critical ear, you can't just sit back and enjoy that audio anymore. You are constently thinking about how it was recorded.
Working.
Exactly. You're constantly thinking about the spaces, the reverbs of the instruments that are, they've been put in the stereo field and everything like that. So, I mean, it's just a case of just critically listening and asking questions about why is that instrument panned that way, or especially in a film mix, sort of why atmospheres are so loud. Or the other side of it with a film mix particularly is that you're not necessarily mixing for pleasure, but for the ear, you're telling a story. The sound is accompanying the visual imagery, so you're telling a story with sound as well, which is a whole different world and of ways to play on emotions with the audience. So it's not a case of necessarily making it sound beautifully polished. It's about creating an environment for the audience to experience the story. So critical listening kind of comes into that, in some sense of, you're not always trying to achieve the best possible sound, but it's what fits and what works visually, with the rest of the project. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers that question.
No, I think that absolutely does. I think there's a lot of great takeaways there, and yeah, definitely check out that app, folks out there, if you're really serious about trying to develop your critical ear. Now, my next question here, and this is really interesting to me because we all in audio, there's similar tools, right? Mm-hmm. And it's how you apply those tools is where it's different. And I'm curious, when you are mixing for film, how might you use a tool like equalization?
Well, I think the big thing with EQ in terms of audio post-production for any kind of visual media is the difference between post-production and music will probably be the fact that with post-production, you're not always 90% of the time, you're not using things like EQ to be creative necessarily. You're not trying to change the sonic character of that sound. You're merely using it as a corrective tool. So from location recordings, if there's kind of a little bit of wind rumble that comes in, you might want to roll off from a certain point. If the mic was slightly too close on a voiceover, you can kind of adjust the low end on that, as well as just taking out kind of resonant frequencies in people's voices and the environments that you've been recorded in. I always employ it as a much more corrective tool than whether I'm trying to be more creative with it, as you probably would have that approach in music, if that kind of makes sense. I mean, I've not done a whole great deal of music mixing or recording, so you can probably talk a bit, advise me a bit more on that, on how you would approach it in music. But definitely in post-production, I would just employ it as a corrective tool rather than trying to be creative with it. It's about trying to make it sound as it should to the audience rather than it trying to sound beautifully polished, so to speak.
Right on. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I would say just for music, I think EQ is both, because I think you do use it correctively in music sometimes.
Oh yeah, true. Yeah, very true.
But yeah, you're right in the sense that EQ can also be very creative, and a lot of people use it that way. I mean, I use it that way as well. And yeah, for film, you're probably, you're probably not going crazy like, oh yeah, I just want to really boost this guy here or cut this out and see what happens.
I mean, it also works with, especially if you've got a kind of a really built up scene, I was talking about with like loads of tracks, you might want to boost it a few dB at sort of 3 or 4K just to bring out the sibilance in a dialogue to help it just cut through that mix a little bit more. Because obviously dialogue is the most integral part of any story. So that is what the audience should be able to hear very clearly at all times. And there has been recent situations here in the UK with rising complaints from listeners regarding to mumbling actors. I don't know if you've heard about this. So things like that can really help by using EQ in that way to help cut through a mix, just what you need to hear. You might solo that dialogue track and it sounds horrible, but in context of the entire mix, it works, and that's what is important.
Kind of going off that, I recently watched Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them with my wife.
That. Yeah.
And I understand that he was trying to go for this because of the character, but there was just some mumbling lines there that were kind of hard to hear. So maybe that's the kind of thing where some EQ might have helped a little more.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, I think with the case of that, I haven't been on location. It's a difficult battle to fight with, especially with directors as a sound person. You don't want to be that guy who's halting production and impeding the schedule because you're having problems. But at the end of the day, it's your responsibility to raise them. So, if an actor's mumbling, even if it is part of their character, there is an issue of intelligibility there on location. There's only so much you can do with it after in post-production. It's about getting it right at the source. And with directors knowing the script inside out as well, what they might be able to, if they've got the script in front of them and they're reading the lines as it's being delivered, that might make perfect sense. But of course, the audience at home are not going to have that. So,
absolutely. So, kind of moving on from this, but really, these are the two tools that are so common. And I'm not sure how much you might even use this tool, but when you're mixing for post-production for film or what have you, how might you use a tool like compression? Or do you use a tool like compression?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's kind of similar to EQ in that respect, in terms of not necessarily corrective, but it's much more about controlling the dynamics rather than trying to apply any kind of sonic characteristic to any sound. I mean, there are certain situations where maybe in explosions or things like that you kind of want to compress it, not only to limit the dynamic range to get it to fit into the mix, but you also want to give it that kind of harshness and also the kind of the low end character that you could get by doing that. But it completely depends on the project. I mean, a lot of the kind of online content that I produce, which is mainly just sort of sound effects or dialogue, music, and a few kind of Foley sound effects, I normally only would put sort of dialogue on the EQ track, and I'd only use it where I felt like it needed it. So probably setting a reasonable threshold and only using a very slight ratio, nothing too. Sure. I mean, I personally don't like going anything above sort of 2.5 to 1, because especially on dialogue, that can really start to impede the quality of the voice. So.
Sure.
Yeah, I use it sparingly unless I need to kind of achieve a certain effect or kind of feel like it could help achieve a certain effect that I want to achieve. But ultimately, it's probably, I mean, again, I've not done too much music production and music mixing, but I would presume that post-production would use it a hell of a lot less than a music would, or rely on it a lot less, should I say, probably.
Yeah, but I would also say that the same philosophy really should apply when people are using compression. You don't, unless you're specifically going for effect, over compressing is just bad news. And so kind of what you were saying, obviously, again, it's different when it's just dialogue, but using it as a tool and lightly and with intention is just so critical.
Yeah.
Rather than, some people out there just slapping a compressor on it and saying, okay, I'm going to crank this up, 40 to 1, whatever, that's something like that. So it seems like that's at least a similar philosophy. So now you have talked before about this a little bit, but, location sound recording. And I think this is just interesting for me. It's just in terms of, I make tutorial videos and things like that. And so I'm recording on location sometimes, though I didn't study that. Could you give an overview of maybe some of the specific miking techniques or general philosophies you might employ when you are, doing some location sound recording?
Sure. I mean, it really depends on the situation and the environment.
Sure.
But there are some kind of blanket kind of ideas or kind of unwritten rules that are kind of professionals follow to kind of get the best results. So I don't know, if I describe a scenario of, say, being outside in a noisy environment on a street, if we were outside doing vox pops, for example, interviewing members of the public on the street for camera work, in those sorts of situations, we'd normally use a shotgun microphone.
Yeah.
So a long, thin microphone with a very narrow pickup pattern in terms of its polar pattern, which is mainly directly from the front of the capsule and also a little from the behind as well. Mm-hmm. And those microphones have interference tubes on either side. So they're able to significantly reduce in volume and also reject any sound coming from either side of the microphone. So it really allows you to kind of pinpoint your specific target, if that makes sense. I always describe
where the source is. Yeah,
exactly. I always describe it, and it's so crucial with positioning, and that's why boom operators, I think, are the most underrated people on a film set in terms of how skilled they are in being able to manipulate and maneuver that microphone around in between actors, swinging it as they're speaking to allow that specific. I always describe it as like a laser coming out of the end of the microphone. You want to make sure that laser is hitting. If that invisible laser would be hitting between the mouth and the sternum area of the chest, to be able to get the natural sound that as an audience we're all used to hearing. Anything else a few inches either side of that kind of axis, and you'd be getting some significant colorization of that sound. So those certain microphones, I'm actually using one. I'm in the middle of moving studio, so some of my stuff's boxed up at the moment. So currently using a Sennheiser MKH416 just talking into right now. So I'm actually talking through a shotgun mic right now. Not probably the best use of the mic, but it sounds all right.
Sounds pretty good to me.
Great. But then when you kind of go indoors, you can kind of run into issues with reverberation or early reflections in certain rooms. Oh, yeah. So depending on how reverberant the room is, you would choose to use a different kind of pickup polar pattern on a microphone for that. Mainly, you'd look at using more of a hypercardioid to avoid the reflections entering the back of the microphone, like you would get with a shotgun. So using one of those instead to kind of, again, minimize those reflections. And the use of radio microphones as well, hidden under clothing. They are very good at reducing very targeted kind of personal mics. So it's hard to describe unless you listen to a recording of a boom microphone on a voice and then a radio microphone, at the difference in the ambience levels in the background. It's almost like sometimes with a radio microphone, you've kind of stripped away a lot of that ambience and you've kind of got a very close-up personal mic sound. But that is always, I mean, to my ears anyway, a boom microphone will always sound superior. And whenever I do recording, I always try and use the boom as much as possible. But there are certain situations where the boom just won't sound as good in that space with that particular shot, with that frame line that you've got to stay out of. So it's about using the right mics for the job. And the great thing with advances in radio microphone technology is as the transmitters get smaller, as you can use more and more transmitters together on a set. So you can have, say, 4 or 5 actors mic'd up at once, God knows how many more as well. So there's a wide range of possibilities there that you can capture all of those radio microphones at once and have a boom operator as well. And it's about giving post-production as many options as possible. So those decisions can be made in the studio afterwards about what sounds better and what's going to work for that scene, as how they've decided to approach it with the rest of the sound that they're going to add in post-production, whether the sound of the reverberance in the room from the boom mic will work in that space, or whether they actually want a cleaner signal to apply reverb to afterwards, so they can control the amount of reverb that they add to that voice in that space. The main aim of location sound is to capture the dialogue as cleanly and as neatly as possible, because it's a lot easier to add things to a voice than it is to take them away. So that is kind of the main kind of ideology, I guess, even down to the point of, trying to reduce footsteps on location. There's products out on the market. I think there's a product called Hush Heels. I've not personally used them, but I know some friends of mine who have, who you would put them on underneath the shoe to avoid the shoe making sound when anybody walks on a particular surface, to help reduce, to minimize the opportunity of that sound bleeding onto the dialogue track, so that everything else can be added in afterwards, because that way you've got the most control over what it likes. If the director says those footsteps are a bit too loud for me, you have the ability to bring those down rather than them being burnt in, so to speak, to the dialogue track. So yeah, I hope I haven't rambled on too much about it. It's the sort of thing that I can talk about for ages. So.
No, that's really interesting. And I think kind of some key takeaway there is, you mentioned using the right microphone for the job, and especially when you're recording anything, and certainly music as well. I encourage folks out there to, build out that microphone locker slowly but surely, and, really think about the decisions you're making, whether you're recording an instrument, whether you're recording a vocal, and then also consider the space you're working in. And yeah, it's kind of like you said, Matt, that the more options you give yourself, that can only help, for sure.
Definitely. Yeah. Especially, it's great that for me to be able to, when I was doing location sound a bit more prominently, having a hand and knowledge of the post-production side of things, because that will, kind of helps with knowing what would help me in post-production. So how to approach my location sound recording to be able to give whoever will be doing the post-production the most flexibility as possible.
Yeah, you would know if there was a decision that, like, oh man, this is going to make someone pull their hair out.
Exactly. This is going to be like 3 hours of work if I don't sort it out now. So yeah.
Right on. So again, and that goes back to getting it right at the source, which is something I'm always harping on like a broken record here.
Totally.
Well, my last question for you, Matt, and for folks out there, maybe, you never really thought about this side of the audio world. Certainly, Matt, you mentioned that you kind of went into audio, interested in music and stuff, and then sort of discovered this and was like, wow, this is what I want to do. What sort of advice would you give to someone who has that epiphany, as it were, and then they want to break into this side of the pro audio world?
I mean, it's notoriously is. I mean, I think the first thing to realize is, and the quicker you can accept this, the better. I think that it is a very competitive industry. There's so many people who study it who don't really have the heart, who, don't push themselves as much as they should or could. And it's only the people who really dedicate their time. I mean, I've been incredibly fortunate to be able to kind of walk straight from university into a related job in the field and kind of progress my skills and knowledge and career from there. I've been super fortunate in that respect. But I think for anyone who is maybe studying audio at university or college, or is just kind of starting out thinking that this might be a career that they want to get into, just record as much as possible. I often go out and just record stuff randomly, just, with some tools to gather some sound effects for a project maybe, or just to kind of learn a new bit of kit or something like that. It's just about, I think that also goes back to kind of developing the critical ear as well, just recording as much as possible, doing as much as possible, and just kind of developing in that way. And then hopefully as you kind of progress and get more confident and kind of get some good feedback on your work, from there you'll be able to kind of take it on, start getting some regular clients. If you're going to go and work freelance, or whether you're going to go find a facility to work with or a studio to work with. So yeah, I think for anyone starting out, kind of like I did when I was at university, just try and make as much of the time as possible, especially using the facilities as much as possible. I'm mentoring a couple of guys who are just coming to the end of their year on my old course now. I do a mentoring program with the university, and yeah, they're kind of realizing that in a few months' time they won't have access to all of this gear that they've had access to for 3 years. So they're kind of thinking, well, how, obviously it's a lot of very expensive equipment, but they're kind of thinking, well, I'm going to take on a couple of extra projects just before I leave, just so I can maximize the use of it. So yeah, I think just recording as much as you possibly can.
For sure. And I think that's a great takeaway too, just in any pursuit, but certainly any audio pursuit, get out there and just do it and learn and record a track, record something that maybe sounds like junk, but then the next time you do it, it's going to sound a little better. Whatever you're working on, mixing, recording, anything like that, the idea is we can read and I give tips and advice and all that stuff and that's great and please keep listening, but getting out there and doing it is there's no substitute for that. So Matt, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. Thank you very much.
Right on. Well, that's all we have for our show today. I again wanted to thank Matt North for joining me. If you'd like to learn more about his work or possibly seek out his services, you can find him on Twitter. That's at Matt North Audio, or on his website, mattnorthaudio.co.uk. Thank you so much for listening today. And for links and information about today's show and our guest, you can check out our show notes at audioskills.com/podcast. Now go out there and make some great music.
Ready to go even deeper with your recording, mixing, and music production? We've got all the info and techniques you need in one place so you can turn it up. Go to audioskills.com and access a huge library of video tutorials and private workshops so you make progress even faster. Come back next week for a brand new episode of the Audio Skills Podcast.